Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. And I would like to say thank you to Medicinal Genomics for bringing us all together. I know that the pandemic has been a little wonky. Actually, the whole world has gone wonky on us lately. And I would like to thank our panelists for being here today and making this journey. So we are in a wonky world, and I would invite you to think about our colleagues, friends, and family who are undergoing some challenges in Eastern Europe these days. So when you have time later in the day, just take a moment, pause, and give them some thought. They don't have the opportunity that we all have right now, today, and my heart goes out to them. So regulating cannabis is not straightforward, and it is most definitely not consistent across North America and definitely not within the United States. As individual states are slowly, and I do mean slowly, and independently legalizing cannabis, it's often defined as hemp, marijuana, cannabis, all of this other stuff. I mentioned to somebody yesterday that cannabis is still in its infancy stage. We haven't even identified our vocabulary yet. All of the regulating bodies and other interested parties have one goal in mind, and that is to ensure consumer safety. That's the one central thought and one central objective to all of the parties working together. And without getting into the history of the legalizations, or the lessons learned or the lessons not learned thus far on the pathways forward, I am delighted to introduce to you today's panel that represents regulations and mostly around laboratory testing, and a snapshot into the science that's been diligently working towards catching up to regulations, as well as representation from the National Safety Council, which is a nonprofit agency centralized on consumer safety. How many of you here have heard of the National Safety Council? Not too many people. Hold that thought, and you're going to hear more about that later. So I'm delighted to introduce you to today's panelists. The first one here is Kay Doyle. She is the Director of U.S. Public Policy and Legal Counsel for Jazz Pharmaceuticals. Prior to her tenure at Jazz, Kay was one of the inaugural Cannabis Control Commissioners for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and she was charged with implementing the programs for adult use and medicinal use of cannabis, and she's living to talk about it. Kay also served as the primary counsel for the medical use marijuana program, food protection program, and tobacco control program for Massachusetts Department of Public Health. She has also taught marijuana policy and law as an adjunct professor for the New England School of Law. And prior to a public service, Kay practiced land use and civil rights law, litigating in state and federal trial appellate courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court. Right next to Kay is Katie Mueller, who represents the National Safety Council as the Senior Program Manager of the Impairment Practice. She brings 15 years of experience in public safety program planning and project management, public policy creation and communications, traffic safety focus on impaired driving, occupant protection, and community outreach and education. As I mentioned, many of you folks here are not familiar with NSC, so very quickly it was established in 1923 to advocate for workplace and roadway safety. In 2021, NSC members initiated research into a cannabis impairment division through the Division of Alcohol and Drugs Cannabis Division, but you'll hear more on that from Katie. Next to Katie is Jennie Wung, who is the Assistant Branch Chief of the California Department of Cannabis Control. She's worked in the health and safety field for 13 years with specialized experience in food safety, drinking water safety, and environmental compliance. Following her career as a health inspector for the LA County Public Health Department, she expanded her purview to manage the environmental health, environmental compliance, and occupational safety programs for the UCLA Office of Environment, Health, and Safety. She now brings her experience to support the licensed cannabis industry by building compliance structures for the cultivation and manufacturing licensees across the state. She's also living to talk about it. Heather Krug is the State Cannabis Science Program Manager for the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. She has served in this role since 2014. The program includes 3 sections. The Cannabis Laboratory Certification sections performs audits of Colorado retail medical marijuana testing. facilities and hemp testing labs for compliance and suitability for certification under state regs. She's also responsible for the Cannabis Reference Laboratory, which develops methods and tests cannabis products for compliance and public health investigations. Heather also oversees the Marijuana Health Monitoring and Research section, which monitors marijuana use patterns and health impacts across the state. The section evaluates and summarizes existing and emerging scientific evidence about potential effects of marijuana use and administers 2 research grant programs using the data information generated by the program. Heather advises state cannabis policy and regulatory decisions, and she holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Biomedical Science and a Master of Science degree in Forensic Toxicology. And finally, at the end, certainly not least, is Dr. Sherman, who is the Director of Regulatory Affairs at Medicinal Genomics, and they are marketing genetics-based cannabis tests and breeding technologies. Sherman's received his PhD in microbiology at the University of California at Davis and a postdoc training in molecular genetics. His primary responsibility at Medicinal Genomics is to make recommendations to regulatory officials that are tasked with either drafting and or modifying cannabis, hemp, and psychedelic mushroom required microbial testing regs to ensure safe products for patients and consumers. Previously, he was at the New Jersey Department of Health and Public Health and Environmental Labs, where he led teams that started the Cannabis Testing Lab, the Cannabis Microbial Testing Unit, and created a compendium of all state medical cannabis required testing regulations database. So that's our panel, and as for me, among other hats, I serve as the science advisor to the Cannabis Analytical Science Program, which is the cannabis division of AOAC International, which is an independent, nonprofit, non-governmental science organization that's been vetting and publishing testing standards for more than 130 years. And the CASP is very exciting, and on behalf of the AOAC team, we welcome the input and engagement of scientists, laboratories, and governmental agencies, several of whom are on the panel today. And we're going to start with the panel discussion with some questions and then open the floor to questions from the audience. And I invite your engagement and look forward to some dynamic discussions. So when we think about where are we today and what are we doing, I have a question for Jennie. What regulatory checkpoints exist to protect consumer safety?
Hi, good morning, everyone. On behalf of the, speaking for the Department of Cannabis Control in California, we've built in a lot of the safety and regulatory checkpoints into our auditing and inspection program for our licensed facilities. I oversee the inspection program for the cultivation facilities throughout the state, as well as the LA and Central California manufacturing licensees. So we look at things like you would imagine for an audit or a health and safety inspection. We look for things like master manufacturing protocols, other good manufacturing practices, SOPs, solvent purity, and food safety when the facility is creating edibles. So we look at various health and safety checkpoints in that way. Our team of environmental scientists does a really detailed audit because knowing that a large portion of the public that consumes these products are patients and may have compromised immune systems. So we keep that in mind when we're doing these really detailed inspections. At the cultivation sites, we look for pesticides to make sure that the pesticides are on an approved list and they're not banned pesticides or anything like that, and that the list that they've declared at licensure matches what we find on site. So there's a lot of different regulatory checkpoints there. If and when we find deficiencies, depending on the severity, we use a progressive discipline process, working closely with licensees, unless it's an immediate danger to life and health. If it's a contaminated product, we can initiate a recall process, which happened recently. We had our first mandatory recall. And we work really closely with our licensees who acted really swiftly with us to recall the products. If it's if it's something that's an immediate danger to like occupational safety, for example, like an unregistered extraction unit that may be a combustion risk, we work with the fire department to red tag that particular piece of equipment, make sure it's not being used, and that's more on the serious violation side. If it's more minor or moderate, like they didn't post their license, in a visible area, of course, it's just a matter of just a notification to the licensee saying you need to post your license.
Great, thank you very much, Jenny. I appreciate that. Sounds like you guys are busy out there in DCC. Heather, question for you. We have representation from 2 different states, California and Colorado. Can you tell us what CANNRA is and what are the objectives of that organization?
Sure. CANNRA is the Cannabis Regulators Association, and currently CANNRA has about 40 different member states, I think. So essentially every state that has legalized cannabis in some form, primarily medical or adult use, but agencies that have hemp programs are also represented within CANNRA. And what's nice about CANNRA is the primary regulatory body is usually the main member, but if your state chooses to have full membership in CANNRA, any of your state agencies that touch cannabis in any way can join in the discussion. So even things like our Department of Education or Department of Public Safety that, just as law enforcement, they can all be members of the organization to share information. And CANNRA's main goal really is to be a source for regulators to discuss best practices, to discuss lessons learned, and to share, I guess, our experiences with each other in trying to regulate cannabis so that in the end, one of the primary goals there is that CANNRA will be a forum to promote standardization and harmonization in regulations across the country. Obviously, there are challenges with that as each state undergoes their own lawmaking processes and regulatory development processes, which is why we do probably see so much disparity in state regs. But CANNRA is this recently organized group that is really hoping to bring some of that harmonization. It also intends to serve as a group that can help educate others. So again, that could be educating federal lawmakers. So as we look at possible federal legalization, state lessons can be shared with the feds. And also to be kind of partners with industry to again share information both ways and learn how and understand how the regulations really affect the industry. There are certainly goals that as this is all developed that public health and safety, consumer safety, equity, and and other things are really at the forefront of the work of CANNRA.
Thank you very much. And it's so nice to hear that states are beginning to form and not unionize, but harmonize and centralize. So thank you very much. And I'm assuming that Colorado and California are both part of the organization. Awesome. That's great. And Katie, what prompted the National Safety Council's involvement with cannabis?
Sure. So the National Safety Council, like Susan mentioned, is a 120-year-old organization focused on workforce safety, both in the workplace and on the road. And so as cannabis legalization began affecting employers, we have about 53,000 member organizations, and we issued a survey to them kind of asking, what are your concerns about employees and your organizations as is cannabis affecting workplace safety, and how are you addressing it? So what we heard from them was that they needed help. They needed education and they needed resources in order to educate their employees and develop really evidence-based policy. And so we partnered with a few different organizations to develop a project to look at how states are regulating products, and hope to come out with a resource this year really to do what Heather was talking about and really just provide education as others are legalizing and regulating cannabis, to learn the best practices and lessons learned from other states and organizations.
Thank you very much. So there you have it. NSC, and I'm expecting that we're going to have a lot more interaction from NSC moving forward, and this will be terrific. So this is a really quick snapshot into where we are and how we and where we're hoping to go. But now, how did we get here? So let me ask you, Kay. What were your challenges when you were facing state regulators trying to develop a comprehensive testing requirements?
Thank you. It's a great question. And I am talking here today as a former cannabis regulator rather than on behalf of my current employer, so I should make that clear. But
I can't hear you. Can you speak into the, thank you.
reminding me that I'm short.
Thank you.
So when we were working with the Department of Public Health in Massachusetts in 2015, we were trying to develop a comprehensive testing regulation. And typically, to be honest, when we were trying to develop any kind of regulations governing cannabis, we would look to the West and we would look to the examples that were set by Colorado and California. So it's very nice to be on the panel with representatives of those two great states today. But with regard to trying to do comprehensive testing regulations in that particular year, they were just themselves getting into it at that time. So what we were faced with was a lack of federal resources to look at because cannabis was illegal and still is at the federal level, but also a lack of prior comprehensive regulations in the more mature markets. And the problem that we had, in addition to the fact that we didn't have anything to copy from, is that when you are looking at policymakers who are addressing cannabis regulations, not only then but today, their resumes look more like mine than they look like the more scientifically oriented members of this panel or indeed the members of this audience. So we are challenged not only in the fact that we didn't have resources to draw on, but we ourselves were not conversant with the matter that we were trying to regulate. So it was extremely difficult. We needed to draw on experts within the government itself, but then also request help from the outside organizations. And one of the things I would encourage folks in the audience today is to get involved as much as you can, understanding that your time is limited. States need to hear exactly what Heather was referring to earlier, how the regulations are affecting industry. And if you're seeing a problem, please do try and explain what it is so that regulators can try to adjust it. It's very difficult when the stakeholders in a particular environment are not communicating with each other and instead are siloed. It's not a productive way to proceed. So to the extent you can, please provide comment and explain to regulators where you believe that something needs to be addressed rather than confining your comment to publications that we may not read. I think that would be incredibly helpful until such time as CANNRA and other organizations like it, with the help of National Safety Council, manage to achieve a more uniform, standardized environment. I think communication between the different stakeholders in this environment needs to increase. Otherwise, we are going to be left with this patchwork that we currently have in the different states.
Thank you. Thank you. And Kay, I'm just going to follow up on one more thing with you on that. And that is, as a regulator, from the commission perspective, I have heard in the past about Mohammed and the mountain. Can you tell me what might be implied by that?
That was what I was referring to with regard to making sure you're communicating with the folks that are regulating your environment, especially when you're dealing with new and emerging markets. In Colorado, California, and Massachusetts, at this point in our market development, we likely have scientific staff that can advise us and help us. But when you're starting out, like I did when not only the medical program, but the adult use program, you may not have access to that kind of resources in the timeline that you are given either by the legislature or by the citizens in a ballot initiative to get your program up and running. So it is very important for the stakeholders to come to the regulators. Don't wait for them to come to you. Please get your thoughts on paper or, by way of testimony in front of the regulators so they can understand where you're coming from.
Thank you very much. And Sherm, you are a stakeholder, right? An industry stakeholder here. And what successes or challenges or both have you had in the cannabis regulatory space?
I would like to, first of all, tell you a story of how difficult it was for me to make a decision to pivot from being a public servant to being an industry stakeholder. Is that I had bumped into, at a conference, a commissioner from a particular state in a regulatory body, and I had some ideas or recommendations for amendments to their microbial testing rules, and that I said to this individual that there were plenty of individuals or industry stakeholders in her state that could advise for amendments of the rules. And she just looked at me and she said, you know, I don't listen to them. But I'm glad that I'm with Medicinal Genomics the last year now, and the challenges that I face is that there's no federal legalization, and so therefore there's 38 sets of required microbial testing rules. And so one by one, I review the microbial testing rules. I identify areas where we feel to make recommendations to amend rules based on scientific principles. And then the second challenge is to open a dialogue, a true dialogue between our organization and the regulatory body officials concerning our recommendations. Concerning the successes, to be very honest with you, for 5 months, I submitted public comment to various regulatory bodies in multiple states. And all I heard was, and then something happened in November, and various dialogues have been opened where we've been able to dialogue with them. A particular example, in one particular state that I read, the allowable methods, the issues, the challenges are allowable methods, what analytes to test, and the action levels. So one particular state, I read, the allowable methods are USP 1111 and 2025. And I do understand that at the start of this cannabis industry, there were no standards and methods. And so this is why this was adopted. And so, but it also said plating only. And I have 5 decades of experience, all the way from plating systems through qPCR and to sequencing, and therefore I communicated that to them with a recommendation to be open to the AOAC standards and methods that have been certified, and then the director of that agency contacted us, and we've been having open dialogue concerning everything about their rules, and that they are amending the rules, and this is an example of one of our successes. And there are multiple states, we've had success in terms of opening the dialogue.
Thank you. And you brought up AOAC, and actually, for all of the panelists here, well, most of the panelists here, you all have some involvement with the AOAC CASP. Sherman, what prompted you to get involved with AOAC?
I'm glad you asked me that question, Susan. I was absolutely not aware of AOAC CASP program. I am glad that an industry friend of mine alerted me to the existence of this program, because I knew immediately it was necessary, standards and methods. So I reviewed the first year's progress report, and to be honest, I was aghast at the plan or the 3 targets for the next year, the second year. So with an open heart, I simply communicated to AOAC officials that I wish to just simply have a dialogue and to share my understanding of the microbial testing, well, the entire testing space, but specifically microbial testing space. And they agreed to the dialogue, and I simply explained who I was and what my experience. I gave them my recommendations, and that was it. And to my shock, they invited me to be a member of all 4 committees because of the breadth of knowledge that I had accumulated at the Department of Health. And I simply says, well, 1 is enough. And being a microbiologist, I joined the microbial working group. And in the last 2 years, we've been able to have standards and subsequently methods for the detection of the 4 pathogenic strains of Aspergillus, as well as for shigatoxin-producing E. coli and Salmonella. And in the clinical literature for Salmonella and the 4 Aspergillus pathogens, there are clinical cases reported of persons utilizing cannabis or medical cannabis that have had illnesses and also death.
Thank you for that. Heather, you're very involved with AOAC CASP as well. I want to ask you to answer any questions about that. But as you know, that organization is focused on establishing standard test methods. How do you think that might affect regulations or in Colorado or on behalf of CANNRA or any place else?
Sure. Well, I think, I think one of the reasons we got involved with CASP was because we have seen directly the need for more standardization and test methods across laboratories. I truly think part of the issue that we see in variability in test results between labs is because there are so many different methodologies and inconsistencies in methods being used. I do want to say, though, when I'm talking about utilizing more standard methods in cannabis testing, I am not necessarily advocating that every lab should use the exact same method. Again, I don't think that we want to stifle innovation. We don't want to stifle growth in the science. We want to ensure that people are able to do the best testing that they can to use good science. And cannabis is complicated. It itself is a complex matrix, and then we have all these different product types, and so one test may not apply to everything. So when I say that I think the development of standard test methods is really important, again, I think that means development of methods that have been put through a level of rigor that is perhaps more than an individual lab can do on their own. So what AOAC does is, they put out an SMPR, different method developers can submit methods, they have to be proven to meet the requirements of that SMPR by an expert review panel, and the method can be published for first action, and then before its final action, it has to go through multi-lab studies to again be shown to be fit for purpose and to be really reliable as a method. And I think having those types of methods developed, again, will overall benefit the general science and the cannabis industry. And I think as those things are developed and regulators can look to that process, again, of a really robust science, then it gives regulators the ability to say, like, maybe I hope regulators don't say you may only do this one thing, but I hope that regulators will say, this has been proven. If you either need to, do this thing that has been proven, or you have to at least demonstrate that your process or your method is equivalent or better. And so that's really why I think things like AOAC CASP are really important in the science space of cannabis.
So I guess this would go back to both Heather, you Heather, as well as Jennie. Would you see these standards as being supporting the regulatory efforts in your respective states?
I'll be brief and then let Jennie talk. But yeah, absolutely. Again, I think, it's not, If anybody's ever participated in legislative or regulatory development, what any individual person who is involved with these things thinks may be best doesn't always mean it works out that way in the regulatory or legislative process. But again, if we want to make evidence-based policy decisions, if we want to make things based in science, we have to have these standards and these processes to look to. If we don't have them, then how are we going to make those decisions? So again, it doesn't always mean that we're going to always make the right choices in regulations or policy, but again, having the resource and the data and the facts is extremely helpful.
Thank you. Jennie, do you have anything to add?
I actually don't have purview over the laboratory side, so I'm just going to echo what Heather said. I agree. It may be not the same exact standards for every method, but if it's been tested and shown that it's rigorous enough, absolutely.
Great, thank you. And Jennie, by the way, I understand that the California structure recently changed from the BCC to the DCC. Can you very briefly talk to us about the differences and what prompted that change?
Yeah, actually, prior to July 12th, there were 3 licensing agencies for cannabis in California. There was the BCC, the Bureau of Cannabis Control, which oversaw distribution and retail licenses. Cannabis, which was under the CDFA, the California Department of Food and Agriculture, which oversaw cultivation. And my legacy agency was CDPH, and I was from the manufactured cannabis safety branch, and we oversaw the manufacturers. Come July 12th, we consolidated agencies into the main Department of Cannabis Control, it's a new agency. And that was really to offer a better, regulatory structure for our licensed market, to streamline efforts, to combine resources so that we could be more efficient and more effective as a regulatory agency in California.
Excellent, thank you so much. That helps me understand what's going on. So it's always a dynamic industry, isn't it? Katie, question for you, and that is, how do we elevate safety as a priority as cannabis regulations evolve?
Yeah, well, I think one of the key here, I've heard everyone say it, is engaging science in the policy decision-making process, right? Engaging those individuals who are doing the research and validating the methods in the regulatory process, or encouraging them to be engaged. At the National Safety Council, we did that. For example, when we embarked on product testing regulation research, we gathered a scientific advisory board of toxicologists and microbiologists and others who were involved in the research, because we are not researchers. And although we hope to come together and have a resource that others can look to for best practices, we know that knowledge cannot only just come from us. And then look to the data. There's lots of great research happening in the field, and I think that as policies are developed on the state level and on the federal level as well, we have to utilize the data that's available and look at the states who have learned lessons and elevated safety in their own regulatory situation and emulate those in others. I think that training is another area that we need to prioritize, and that's worker safety training. That is training for individuals to recognize impairment, and there are just a lot of areas that workforce training, public health training is needed as we regulate cannabis.
Thank you very much. And Kay, as a former regulator, what are some of the practices or maybe even best practices that you might recommend to regulators who are implementing new systems or reinventing their systems?
Sure. Well, I think we raised some of them already on the panel, and particularly the independence of the laboratories not having ownership in common with the people that they are testing or the entities that they are testing, engaging with the scientific community and being open to the kind of dialogue that Sherman was discussing earlier, and also interacting with CANNRA, which was starting to become what it is now today back in 2015, but it was very much at a seed level. And I think these organizations, as well as AOAC, are critical to regulators such as myself who do not have a scientific background to understand what is being told to them and to try and find a balance and create regulations that make sense prior to a centralized regulatory authority by a science-based agency.
Thank you. And most people who know me know that I am not shy about saying that some regulations, although very well intended, are not necessarily always that practical and founded in pure empirical science. So it sounds like we're still on the pathway forward and we're using many resources to get there. So taking that rational approach, looking at science and moving forward, I think is great. And as we've all been talking about, this is a very dynamic system. So I'm just kind of going to throw this out to everybody. We still have about another 20 minutes left in our session, and I have more questions to fire off at our panelists. But at this point, do you have any questions that you would like to raise? Please step up to the microphone. Now we'll really test them, right?
Yeah. Good morning, and thank you for being here. Had a question from a laboratory's perspective. By the time we actually test something, it's too late to do anything about product quality. I'm interested in where you see laboratories fitting into haptic, GMP, GAP, and any ancillary testing that we could be providing that would ensure product safety and compliance.
Would you like to direct that to anyone in particular, or just open it up to anybody?
Yeah, specifically on haptic and GMP.
Okay. Would any of you folks like to?
What could laboratories contribute to?
Well, when we talk about laboratory testing, can I ask you to qualify that for me? Do you mean third-party independent testing to comply with requirements, or?
Well, third-party independent testing, but any testing that would be done as part of a haptic plan or GMP or GAP plan should be done by an independent laboratory.
So the compliance testing is different from GMP?
Correct.
Right? We know that. Okay. Just as long as we're all on that same page.
Anything in addition that laboratories could do to assure that.
Okay.
If I missed the last thing you just said, let me know, because I couldn't quite hear you. But I think most states allow for the third-party labs to do R&D testing for the licensees, and I think that's a big part of it in our current sort of scheme is that, whether it's you as a laboratory educating your clients on the importance of actually testing things while they're in progress versus just only doing that required test at the end, right? If we think about what GMP really is and how that, would typically go, people would really be looking a lot more at their inputs than I think what typically happens in the cannabis industry. Again, as regulators, like our concern, right, is that final product. So, typically, and it varies from state to state where you're required to test, but again, our goal is that that final product is compliant and as safe as possible for the consumer. But again, if you as a manufacturer really want to understand your manufacturing process, if you really want to ensure that by the time you reach your final product stage that you do have a quality product, that you will pass your testing, I don't know how you do that without doing some in-process testing. Again, you might want to test your inputs that you purchase from other vendors. You may want to test midstream in your production process. Exactly what is important to you is up to your business process. Again, there was a risk analysis discussion earlier this morning. Like, risk assessment is really important. And I think unfortunately a lot of cannabis industry doesn't really understand that because all they really know is the regs say I have to test my end product. But so I think there's a lot of education to be done, and you as a lab can help explain that to them, what your testing services can offer to them in that regard. Because even though, when we look at more standard GMP and other industry, that often involves in-house testing, right? A lot of facilities will have their own labs. Well, for one, labs are very expensive, so a lot of cannabis companies currently don't have them, and even if they had the option to, if they weren't required to use a third-party lab, they may not want to invest in that expense. And again, you guys, the labs are truly the experts in the science, so why not utilize your services and your expertise rather than trying to build that in-house? So I hope that helps with some of your questions, but I think there's a lot of education and understanding that still needs to be done in that regard.
Thank you. And I think we have a question on here, this side.
Hello. Thank you all for the work you do, everybody on the panel. I'd like to just ask this question to the panel. So speaking of plating-based methods, we recently also had a large recall in Michigan. What is the regulatory approach for auditing products in Colorado and California to confirm or refute previously recalled products with safety concerns? How do we approach this with plating methods that have such lack of reproducibility internally and amongst other labs as well?
Sounds like a question for Sherman.
Yes, I monitor the recalls from the various states, and so I've seen an increase in the frequency of recalls for cannabis products that have, that are tested to be beyond the action levels for total yeast and mold, for aspergillus, and there are other contaminants that I focus on, the microbial. The one thing you mentioned, plating systems, and this is very problematic in the sense that, let's just take the example of, total yeast and mold, is that, first of all, cannabinoid, in the literature, the cannabinoids have been shown to have antibiotic activity. So when I say that word to myself, I think bacterial. But if you also go into the literature, there are certain antibiotics that, besides affecting the growth of bacteria, also affect the growth of total yeast and mold. That's been shown in a paper that we recently published, where in the plating system of DRBC, which has chloramphenicol and an additional antibiotic, actually decreased the growth of aspergillus by 5-fold on this plating system. Secondly, there's endophytes. You're not measuring all the total yeast and molds. That's been shown also in the literature. And that's why we are a proponent, of qPCR testing.
So I'm wondering if this might be an opportunity where Jennie might talk about, in California anyway, how do you handle when I'm sure this never happens anywhere, but there's a discrepancy or there's a deficiency during an investigation or something on the COA doesn't quite line up. It would never happen in reality, right? So it's all hypothetical. How do you handle that in California?
Yeah, I don't have direct purview over the lab side, but we did have a recent recall that we did execute at DCC. If there is a deficiency in lab results, generally licensees are very helpful and move very swiftly to help us in a voluntary recall. If a COA doesn't pass, they also have the option of remediation, which is sending it back to a manufacturer to either repackage it or correct it for any kind of deficiency. That could mean, again, repackaging or drying if the LR activity was too high, remediating for molds or for heavy metals or pesticides or something if possible. Generally, the edibles are more difficult to remediate unless it's packaging. And so those are kind of deficiencies on the COA testing side. Again, the deficiencies that come out of a compliance inspection of a facility, we work through we work closely with licensee to correct them depending on the risk.
Thank you very much. And I believe we have a question over here.
Yes, thank you. I have two questions. The first one is, what is going on with any kind of standards writing or application, either proposed or generic, I know that ASTM had their D37 committee and was looking into it. I was on that committee for a while. I found it very slow-moving, actually, thorough, but slow-moving. But they're certainly a respected organization. I don't know where they're at. But it would seem to me that at least some kind of standards from which state agencies could, or private sector could comply either voluntarily or with some modifications are well needed in the industry for everything from labeling, packaging, dosing, what have you. My second question is, and if you don't mind, I'll take that liberty. And you may not be the right panel for it, but I imagine you'll have something to say anyway, because most people do. What in the world is going on with the FDA and CBD? We're 3.5 years since the Farm Bill was passed. There's a remains tremendous confusion, what I like to call the Rubik's Cube between laws and regulations and industry knowledge. As a lawyer, it's hard enough to advise people what to do with this industry and to do it safely and correctly without violating, well, too many laws, but to try to explain, yes, hemp is a legal product, but no, you can't sell CBD if it's an ingestible because the FDA hasn't gotten around to it. So with those liberties, I look forward to your comments.
If it's okay, I'll take the first question there. With respect to standards, so as we know, the regulations came out before the standards came out, right? So standards organizations, AOAC, ASTM, many of them have been running really fast to try to catch up to regulations, and we're kind of like doing this right now. And education has become a very strong part of that whole process. So I also was very involved with ASTM. In fact, I was a founding member of D37, but I'm no longer involved with ASTM. There are only so many volunteer activities I can handle. So I put my energy into AOAC, and it's a very robust process. As Heather mentioned earlier, it's not a popularity contest. It's not a, we need a method, oh, I'll write one. Great, it's great, it sounds great, let's vote it in, it's now a standard. It's a very, very, very rigorous process that it goes through. So standard methods already exist. We have first action methods for cannabinoids in plant material, in concentrates and oils. We have methods for heavy metals. We have methods for beverages coming out. So we do have those methods. Many of them are from private organizations. Eurofins was, if you're familiar with Eurofins, is responsible for the very first potency or cannabinoid method that's out there. So they do exist, they are catching up, but they're put through a lot of rigor before they become standard test methods. They have to go through a vetted expert review panel where you can't just sign up and say, yeah, I want to vote on a method. You actually have to have qualifications to be on that committee and review it. So they are catching up. And our panelists here are part of that. And, you know, on the other side of that saying, oh, you know, you feel like a limp noodle after you've submitted a method and it's gone through that ERP, and medicinal genomics has gone through it on behalf of the product testing side of it as well. So about a year or so ago, a number of products were put through the ringers of hell for product standardization for total yeast and mold. Medicinal genomics was one of them. So it's not an easy process to get through. But right now, organizations like AOAC are working very hard. As the advisor for that particular program, we have scientists from around the world. We have working groups that number in the hundreds, and try managing a phone call with 100 people on the line from 7 or 8 different countries, all coalescing on one scientific method. It's not an easy process. But we're all working together, recognizing that the regulatory landscape is ever so changing, and trying to keep up with that, and also trying to educate regulators on the empirical science side of that. So all of that is moving forward. Now, as for the other question, I'm not on that panel. I don't have to answer that question. I'm going to leave that to our friends here. Have at it.
Well, I don't know, as none of us are actually working at the FDA, we obviously can't answer that question with any degree of confidence or knowledge. But We do know that the FDA is taking some enforcement action, in fact, did so just this week regarding companies not only that are selling CBD, but also for the first time Delta-8, and making claims that the FDA deemed appropriate. So they are taking some action, but I think, as everyone in this room is aware, have not yet issued any sort of nationwide regulations. We certainly, I think, look forward to the day that that does occur, but unfortunately it has not yet. And I think the FDA is in the best position to do that in a way that it puts public health and public safety at the forefront.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next question.
Thank you, guys. A great panel. Wow, this mic's really. I had a couple questions. I think I'll drop this one. First one, do you guys on the panel see any possible way to regulate the enormous amounts of waste that's being produced? For instance, in California, it has to be packaged products. Huge amounts of waste the lab produces when they have to, open up all these products, not just paper or cardboard, but the batteries themselves. We have to find, ways to recycle that. Is there any thought on ever kind of regulating that or finding a way around it? The environmental concerns, yesterday we had a panel around it, and it's of concern. That's my first question.
That is something that has been discussed, including the tags that are used for track and trace. But I've heard that there are companies now that are looking to recycle them once the RFID chip is removed from the tags. It is a concern. I think I would have to check in with CalRecycle to better answer your question. So if we can connect off after the panel, I can try to find out the answer for you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm really hoping, it's great to see you all together, that there'll be some kind of future collaboration amongst the states to sort of simplify and standardize. And I think Susan answered my other question, which was really around, do you foresee adopting, CASP or some other compendial method and giving the industry, especially laboratories, opportunity to either adopt that or at least be prepared? And I ask this in light of, January 1st, right? There's about, 7 months left. Will there be opportunity for that, or will it be, okay, now adopt this in the next 30 days?
It's not uncommon for other industries to defer to an AOAC or USP method. In fact, you can go to the FDA website for some testing where the FDA will defer to an AOAC method, for example, or an ASTM method, for example. So I personally foresee that happening in the future if there comes a time when the FDA or other federal regulatory body steps in, that they may very likely defer laboratories to a specific compendial method. But no mind readers here, I don't have a crystal ball. But judging from other industries, I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case.
Thank you.
Hello again. Current California law allows for an RPD of 30% in potency analysis, plus or minus. I'm curious if with the adoption of standardized methods, if that would be tightened. A laboratory can be off by 30% and their analysis still be valid. If that's still the case with a standardized method, nothing's going to change.
So I'm sorry, it's just a little, the monitors are weird to hear, but you said California labs are allowed to be off of their results?
California regulations have an RDP of 30%.
Plus or minus 30%.
Minus 30%. So again, is that, there's a difference there though, and again, is the laboratory allowed to be off by 30%, yes, or is the label number allowed to be within 30% of the laboratory's test result?
The results of the laboratory can vary plus or minus 30%.
Wow.
Be within regulation. So the question is there going to be a tightening of that criteria with the adoption of standardized methods?
I would hope so. Yeah, go ahead, Susan.
So the AOAC is nonpartisan, it's non-governmental, right? It's for the public. It's not for anything private. So when the method performance requirements are published and there's a solicitation for methods, we make every effort to keep it as broad as possible, as long as it's scientifically sound. Up to this
Right.
point, CASP has been focusing on meeting regulatory requirements because the industry is desperate for those test methods to meet regulatory requirements. But we all recognize that a lot of those requirements are not necessarily founded empirically. So it's a very difficult balance in developing those standard methods. Now, if we're not chasing a regulation and we establish the performance requirements of a method, then life is good, right? Now it's up to the state to either require a lab to meet our requirements, the standard requirements, or not. But AOAC methods do not dictate to the state, but the state does have the ability to dictate back down to the standard method. So that process belongs to the state.
The question really pertains to the development of standard methods and whether or not that would be a consideration.
I hope so, but there are so many things that I wish for in this industry, in the testing industry. And my hope is that the regulatory bodies that Kay and others have so profoundly mentioned today have not necessarily based on a scientific foundation. But now we have an institution like CASP that's available and providing that education. So my hope is that in time, those regulations will become more in line with better or more sound science. And I know I'm not answering your question very directly. I'm trying to be, I have my own opinion, but I'm trying to be cognizant and respective of all of the regulatory environment.
Thank you.
My turn. That's not too loud. So going back to the cannabis control, the regulatory limits for some of the Category 1 pesticides from the Cannabis Control Group for here in California, has there been discussion about perhaps making those more scientifically valid? Because to say not detected is your lower limit is, I don't know, the statistics aren't there, so I don't know if there's any movement on trying to make that more of a normal value. I'm not saying that right, but the way it is now to say that if you detect anything at all, even though it's below your limit of detection, you have to call that bad, it violates science. So what do you think?
Look at me anymore.
So I can try to, I'm not from California, so I can't really say what the regulators are possibly going to do in terms of defining that, but I think your concern is very valid. For one, a lab shouldn't be reporting a detection below their limit of detection as a result, because again, it's below the limit of detection. In theory, you can't see it, and you certainly can't see it with any accuracy. But two, saying that the limit of detection is the action limit, it also, I think, is problematic because different laboratories are going to have different detection limits based upon their individual methodology. So you may take the same sample to two different labs and pass at one and fail at the other when it's based upon the limit of detection, and it doesn't actually mean either lab is wrong. So I think that's also very challenging then to understand as the customer submitting the result or the sample for results, but also it will further drive our problems with lab shopping, where again, labs may be tempted to make an artificially high limit of detection so that they can pass more samples that shouldn't actually be passing. But we could probably spend another hour or two talking about the challenges with pesticides and trying to come up with action levels for cannabis, given that the EPA has not established tolerance limits for pesticides on cannabis. And so I completely understand why California has defined those Category 1 pesticides as a not detect. But again, as we just talked about, there's a lot of challenges with that. So I think regulators across the country are grappling with how to require testing and establish action management limits for pesticides in cannabis. We're having an ongoing working group in Colorado, and frankly, we've been talking about pesticides for years. We're looking at it right now again, and it's just it's a really complicated debate to try to figure out how to do this when we don't have the data that we would normally have for something that, would normally be a federally defined number, so.
We are, I'm so sorry to say, out of time. And we are 1 minute over, but if you are game, maybe we can field one more question. Or we can say thank you very much to our panelists. And I thank you on behalf of all of us here up on the stage for your participation and engagement. If you have any questions, catch us when we step down or when they step down, and enjoy the rest of the day. Take care.